Hello, everyone. Our lesson for today will be about the domains of life. The picture right here, as you can see, it actually resembles a snake, but this animal is actually considered as a lizard. It comes by the name of European glass lizard. Um, I forgot the genus, but I used this picture for us to strike a question. Like, ano nga ba yung ginagamit natin in classifying organisms? Is it just based on morphology? Like, say, for example, if you try to look at it, if you, say, for example, encounter this organism in the wild, it will definitely look like a snake. But why isn't this organism right here not considered a snake? And more generally, if we try to look at a bigger perspective, how do biologists distinguish and categorize the millions of species on Earth despite such striking similarities? An understanding of evolutionary relationships would suggest one way to address some of these questions. We can, by studying the different hierarchies of life, we can decide in which category to place a species by comparing its traits with those of, say, potential relatives. For example, right here, a glass lizard does not have a highly mobile jaw. It has a large number of vertebrae, and its short tail right here, as shown in my pointer, it's located behind the anus, which are traits that are shared by all snakes. Okay, and these and many other characteristics would suggest that despite such superficial resemblance, the glass lizard is actually not a snake. Okay, so as you can see, it's a slender, legless lizard, and ayun, marami siyang characteristics that puts it more as a lizard than a snake. Learning objectives for this lesson. This lesson is on the domains of life. We should be able to grasp an overview of the three domains of cellular organisms found in nature. Kasi before, we have an understanding that um, merong six kingdom classification, merong five kingdom classification, but now we group organisms basically into three domains. And we need to be able to understand the nature of science as an evolving field of study, especially for categorizing organisms, kasi nga these categorizations are evolving. Okay? All life forms, alam natin, we have established it in our lesson on phylogenetics, share a common ancestor, and all living things have many things in common. Be it an amoeba right here, um, the dragon's blood, no? It's an umbrella-shaped tree with a red sap that is used as a paint and a varnish. So this is something that's one of the most notable plants, I think, in Madagascar, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, one of my favorite organisms, the diatoms. They come in many shapes. They are really interesting if you try to view it under the microscope. And even corals. Corals look like plants, but they're actually animals. So despite all these striking differences, we can still say that all life forms are composed of one or more cells, that they carry out metabolism, and that they transfer energy with ATP, and what else? And then they encode their hereditary information in DNA. Okay? The connection between phylogeny and classification is striking. This diagram right here is simply telling us that uh, at the Linnaean classification, at each of these level or rank as we speak, species are placed in groups with more inclusive groups. So say for example, we have in here carnivora, no? Okay, carnivores, and then you have the Felidae, the Mustelidae, and then the Canidae. So, ibig sabihin, those with more specific siya na Linnaean classification would most likely be situated in one clade. It goes to say that hierarchical classification based on Carolus Linnaeus simply reflects these branching patterns of phylogenetic trees. And alam natin na trees would show evolutionary relationships between some of the taxa. Say, for example, this phylogenetic tree right here, it tells us that Panthera is is the outgroup for this one, while American badger and European otter are more closely related than any another species considered in this cladogram. Ganun lang yung sinasabi niya. Okay? These branching patterns would often match how taxonomists have classified groups of organisms that are nested within these more inclusive groups. And in nature, it's this is the tree of life imagery that is everywhere. Talagang iba-iba yung tree of life na depiction. To some of us, it can be just a one branch, but in other textbooks you can see it highly branching, and each of these branches would represent the representative species that we see now today, that we now see today. Okay, yung earliest forms of the tree of life was actually that of Sir Charles Darwin. Okay? Ito yung kanyang diagram nyo. As you can see, it's like a twig, and then meron siyang number 1, meron siyang D, meron siyang B, C, and A. It's simply trying to map out, if I'm not mistaken, these letters right here, A, B, C, and D, are some of the organisms that he was able to characterize. And each of these nodes, yung kung saan nag-branch out, are specific characteristics that were made to resolve the phylogeny. Okay? Ang sinasabi lang dito na ang sinasabi lang dito ni Charles Darwin was that the planet was so simple at some point, and then those rudimentary life forms later evolved and accumulated such competitive advantages, and later on now we're able to have to retain these advantages. Okay? And one thing that may have led to these adaptations was because of the changing climate of the Earth over time. No, alam natin na Earth before was not what it is today. Okay, and alam natin na the Earth changing over time paved the way for the emergence of these new species, which later on evolved advantageous states. And these advantageous states made them resilient, made them occupy particular niche. Say, for example, single-celled bacteria, malamang nagkaroon ng scarcity of food nutrients at the bottom of the ocean, and then later on they scavenge for other food sources. So say, for example, these single-celled bacteria would go into forests, compared to that those would go into swamps. So later on over time, kasi iba yung conditions in the environment in which they thrive in, nagkakaroon din sila ng advantageous states that make them more capable of thriving in these new environments. Ganun lang yung sinasabi dito. Okay? It's actually a microcosm of the Earth changing over geological time. Okay? And this may have been one of the strongest evidences as to why nagkaroon ng diversity of life on Earth. And we can now see the various life forms that we see today. And as early as the time of Aristotle, tinuruan tayo ng classification of living things. It's actually just discretion what's a living thing and what's not. Okay? So ang una dito was on plants, no? Plants can be small, medium, large. Animals can be land-dwelling, water-dwelling, or air-dwelling. Ganun lang yung kasimple before, okay? However, it was later on when scientists observed that some organisms cannot be classified strictly as being plants or animals. Say, for example, the sponges and corals right here. In the picture, sponges and corals as well would look like plants, but they have characteristics that does not make them a plant. So, can you name them? Okay? Familiar ba? Ano yung hindi kayang gawin ng sponges na ginagawa ng plants? I think on the top of your head would be making their own food. Actually, sponges are animals. They are actually sessile. Ibig sabihin, they are attached to a substrate and they lack these true tissues that would later on be compartmentalized to aggregate it into organs with specific functions. Sponges, in reality, would basically trap these particles that are passing through the internal channels of their body. So say for example, if this is the hollow opening of the sponge right here in my pointer, papasok lang yung water dyan, and then at yung sa gilid, no? Yung sa lining ng sponge would contain choanocytes. Okay, so we will discuss more on that when we talk about these organisms. And these choanocytes would then be responsible for filter feeding. Okay, kung ano yung nakasuspend sa water column. The used to be a known world of organisms was discovered with the arrival of lenses and microscope. That's by Anton van Leeuwenhoek, no? And it was because of the microscope na nagkaroon ng understanding na hindi lang pala plants or animals, hindi lang pala living and non-living thing yung meron din palang mga buhay na organisms na hindi nakikita ng ating mga mata. And yung unang nakita under the microscope was actually that of a protist, ano? And it was in 1866 when German naturalist Ernst Haeckel proposed this kingdom protista. So one thing that I like protista is that it's a very diverse, pero it's also parang if you have a cabinet in your house na hindi mo alam saan, di ba when you organize things, you put your toiletries there, you put your school supplies, you put your clothes, meron talagang isang compartment in your cabinet na talagang saksak sinagol, di ba? Na hindi mo malalagay any of the three. Ganun yung analogy ko for Proteus, no? This is actually a grouping na marami pang possible na groupings later on, no? The more that we know about these organisms. But right now, the consensus of a Proteus would be any single-celled organism, okay? Any single-celled eukaryotic organism that does not include, ibig sabihin ating bacteria and ating archaebacteria. Okay? Yung difference lang nila is actually their cellular organization. Yung bacteria, single-celled microbes and are prokaryotes. Ibig sabihin prokaryotes, they lack these specialized organelles. I'm sure na discuss na yan in your early biology, no? And its genetic material is not nuclear bound. In contrast, protists are mostly single-celled eukaryotic organisms that are not plants, fungi, or animals. Okay? And some of these would exhibit photoautotrophy, chemoautotrophy, and so on. So ito yung mga, we have next slides to define each of these. No? When we say photoautotrophs, these are organisms that can make their own food using energy from the sunlight and carbon dioxide by the process of photosynthesis. So kabilang sa photoautotrophs would be yung ating higher plants. You have all the higher plants that you can see. Mais, trees, what else? Grass, shrubs, veins, all of these are higher plants. Euglena, say for example, algae, this one right here in the picture, and even that of cyanobacteria. Some bacteria are also photoautotrophic. When we say chemoautotrophic, ito pa pala. Chemoautotrophic naman, these are organisms that still can create their own food kasi autotroph sila. But instead, they harness the energy from and biological materials from inorganic chemicals that are mostly suspended in the environment. So I like these group of organisms, no, the Nitrobacter and the Nitrosomonas. As a fish hobbyist, I appreciate their participation in my pond system kasi without them, madaling namamatay yung mga isda. Kasi nga, these waste, if they're not converted, this ammonium actually is the one that's really lethal. If ammonium ions are not converted into nitrates, then it will not be used. It will not be in a form that will be used by the plants, no? At hindi siya toxic. But with the spike of ammonium, definitely mamamatay yung ating mga isda. Okay, that's chemoautotrophs. Okay, we also have photohetero. Photo, ibig sabihin, they still use light, okay, as a source of energy. However, yung pinagkaiba nila sa photoautotrophs is that these organisms cannot use carbon dioxide as their source of carbon. Instead, they would use organic compounds from the environment. So say for example natin will be our purple non-sulfur bacteria, the green non-sulfur bacteria, and in this one, Helicobacter. Okay? Also a pathogenic disease that's of importance in public health. Okay? We have chemoheterotrophs. So ayan, most animals and fungi. Organisms that derive energy by ingesting intermediates or building blocks that is incapable of creating on its own. So I think that's very obvious, you know. And it was actually French marine biologist Edward Chaton who termed prokaryotes eukaryotes in 1937. Okay? Alam na natin yung distinction niya, no? Later, when it was learned that prokaryotes were distinct from eukaryotes, the four kingdom scheme was proposed by Herbert Copeland at dito nagkaroon ng distinction na lahat ng single-celled prokaryotes will be different from protists, di ba? Kanina, single-celled eukaryotes will be that of protists. But single-celled prokaryotes, including bacteria this time, will be placed under Monera. Okay? This was proposed by Herbert Copeland again. Okay? However, in 1950s, botanists discovered that some plants were actually non-photosynthetic. Say, for example, yung fungi na andito. These organisms, alam natin, would digest food outside their bodies through protein secretions and would absorb nutrients that in a form that will be readily used by their system. At dito nagkaroon ng kingdom fungi. And fungi are heterotrophs that feed by absorption and do not ingest their own food. So nagkaroon na from the four kingdom scheme of classification, nadagdag si fungi. Okay? Because of this one, Robert Whittaker in 1959 proposed the five kingdom scheme, two divisions. Okay? Two divisions, that's prokaryote and eukaryote. Prokaryote containing solely of Monera, while eukaryote containing that of Protista, Plantae, fungi, and Animalia. Okay? In 1990s, American biologists, dito na introduce yung domains of life. This is relatively new. Okay? It basically tries to classify life on planet into three different domains. Okay? Basically, it's a biological classification based on the differences in their 16S ribosomal RNA genes. So later on, titingnan natin yan. Yung quick background nito, actually Carl Weiss started molecular studies on Archaebacteria, which were first grouped as Monerans kasi nga they are single-celled prokaryotes. Their genetic material would however resemble that of humans and of prokaryotes more than that of other prokaryotes, kahit single-celled sila. And Archaebacteria, as a quick introduction, these are bacteria that are capable of thriving in such extreme conditions. And they are genetically distinct from other bacteria and would often inhabit such extreme environmental conditions. At the molecular level, in terms of ribosomal structure, they would also differ. Yung possession of intronic region and in membrane structure of their composition, meron akong chart later on that one. It's also very different with that of bacteria. Although single-cell prokaryote siya, pero mas marami siyang similarities with that of eukaryotes than that of other single-cell prokaryotes, in this case, the true bacteria. And this is corroborated by the 16S ribosomal RNA gene na comparison. Okay? And because of such close resemblance with that eukaryotes, we proposed that life be divided into three domains and that eukaryota and Archaebacteria would be more closely related with each other. He later then decided the term Archaebacteria was a misnomer and simply shortened it to Archaea. Okay? So, true pa din yung kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, okay? Weiss is simply suggesting the creation of a new taxon, yung ating three domain. Okay? Eukarya would include all eukaryotes, bacteria, the single-celled prokaryotes that are true bacteria, and Archaea would be those of Archaebacteria. Okay? So, yung ginamit niya, sinabi ko kanina, was that of the ribosomal RNA gene. Okay? So, uh, kinuha lang yung sequence ng ribosomal RNA and then kinumpare, and it was found out that ribosomal RNA of Eubacteria and Archaebacteria share closest homology. Of eukaryotes and Archaebacteria shared closer homology than that of Eubacteria. Okay, and that is why in the domain of life, closer si Archaebacteria to eukaryotes. Okay, ito yung sinasabi kong table of the different characteristics. So you need to be familiarized with this one. Sinabi natin kanina, no, ang at in terms of ribosome, mas similar si Archaebacteria, Archaea, andyan si Eukarya, pero etong kay Eukarya is ATS. ATS, ibig sabihin meron siyang 80 subunits, okay? Meron akong illustration later on what do we mean by subunits, okay? For the initiator transfer RNA, both Archaea and Eukarya are methionine, while kay bacteria is strictly formyl methionine. Yung sinabi kanina na membrane structure, okay, similar si Eukarya at saka si bacteria, unbranched yung sa kanila, while branched naman kay Archaea. So very distinct siya. No? Kay ester link naman si bacteria and Eukarya, while ester link pero branched naman. Unbranched yung dalawa, si Eukarya at saka si bacteria, branched si Archaea. And this is one of the reasons, kumbaga, kung bakit Archaebacteria can thrive in such harsh conditions. Kasi nga branch yung kanyang membrane lipid. Kasi yung atin, 'di ba, meron siyang yung ating lipid bilayer, 'di ba, meron siyang space in between. But ester link that's branch, ibig sabihin magkakasunod, parang ano siya, diretso lang talaga siya, wala siyang gap in between. And that is one of the reason why very sturdy yung kanyang membrane structure, na despite very salty environment, very hot environment, with high pressure environment, it still can be able to survive. Okay? Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina na subunit, no? Yung kay Eukarya at saka kay Eubacteria or kay bacteria, it's only kay Archaea at saka kay bacteria 70S lang. But kay Eukarya, meron siyang subunits dito. Ito yung mga V1, V2, V3, V4. No? These would account for these subunits. Okay? And one of the most commonly used ribosomal RNA, especially for metagenomics, would be 16S ribosomal RNA. It's actually, S actually is a Svedberg. It's a unit of measurement or the sedimentation rate of nucleic acids. And ribosomal RNA is a important constituent of the small subunit of prokaryotic ribosomes, as well as mitochondria and chloroplasts. Okay? And such comparison paved the way for the resolution of the domains of life. Okay? And the more that we study organisms, the more that it challenges our knowledge on classification. Say, for example, in 2010, the first known photosynthetic animal was discovered. It's actually Elysia chlorotica. It's a sea slug, which appears here as a giant swimming leaf. So it's trying to camouflage with its environment. And it was recently found to be the first known animal to make proteins that are essential for photosynthesis. Ang kanilang hypothesis dito is that it stole the genes from the algae that it eats. Kasi Elysia chlorotica is known to feed on a particular green algae, and later on siguro they were able to impose symbiosis with each other, and because of the stolen chlorophyll, ito din impart ng green na pigmentation kay Elysia chlorotica. Okay? So by looking at this, no, it's an animal. It's a sea slug, no? But now it can make its own food because it can make proteins that are putative for photosynthesis. So saan siya ilalagay? Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Okay? So it tells us that science, especially classification, is still an evolving field. Okay? So for the rest of our discussions, we will be talking about archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Okay? So for next meeting, ito yung i-focus natin. Okay? So I hope this lecture helps. No? Kindly read more in advance and kindly check our KHub course page. Okay? Thank you very much and hope this helps. God bless.